After releasing my full movie breakdown for Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, there were still many things to address and expand upon surrounding the events and adaptation of the story that the director has adapted for the big screen. From why the movie ended the way it did in regards to Homer's epic poem, to the importance of Zeus's lore, and that Athena twist, I'm going to be answering some of the biggest questions from the movie in the aim to help those who haven't read the epic poem discover things that were missed. This analysis will contain spoilers, so if you do happen to be someone who hasn't seen the film yet, then I would recommend watching this video after you've seen it. Also, a lot of the things that I discuss continue from what I explained in my full breakdown the other day, so if you're wondering why some things aren't in this video, then that's because I talked about them in my previous one, which will be linked in the pinned comment below. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my upcoming content for Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's dive straight into some of the biggest questions from Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey explained. So with Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, there are a few big questions that the film leaves you with, some that have quite straightforward answers to them, and others that have multiple answers depending on the way you look at them. Starting with the actual ending of the film, there are a few big ones that are on everyone's mind. The first is what actually happens to Odysseus. In recapping the final act of the film, Odysseus arrives back in Ithaca and hopes to see if any of Penelope's suitors are actually worthy of her hand, and he bases that on the way they might treat him. The only kindness or hospitality that he encounters back home comes from his own son Telemachus. Just like in the poem, Penelope eventually puts on a trial for her suitors in their bid to become her husband. We learn that they have to string Odysseus's bow and fire an arrow through a long line of axe heads, and this is something that only Odysseus is able to do. When the trial eventually begins, all of the suitors' weapons are locked away and the door is boarded up to ensure no one leaves. The suitors are not able to string Odysseus's bow, so Odysseus himself steps up as the beggar to complete the challenge. He does so in chilling fashion, revealing to the suitors that he is the king of Ithaca, and immediately follows it by killing them off one by one with the help of Telemachus. After a long brutal battle, Odysseus then overpowers Antinous and kills him, leaving himself heavily injured by the end of the fight. It's very similar to what happens at the end of Homer's epic poem, but what follows the fight includes things that Nolan has changed. One thing in particular is the immovable bed plotline, as in Homer's poem, Odysseus reveals to Penelope that he is her husband by sharing what he knows about the bridal bed. In the film, however, Odysseus' final conversation with Penelope becomes a confession. Their conversation is not just about the long painful years that Odysseus has spent trying to return home, but about the guilt he still carries from the events of Troy. He tells her that he won't die, but that he will leave Ithaca, choosing exile as a kind of self-imposed punishment for slaughtering the suitors. He knows that their families will be furious, which echoes the fallout described in the final chapter of Homer's poem, and he refuses to let that violence spark another cycle of revenge against Ithaca. So Nolan changes the ending a bit to provide more symbolic meaning for the future, and he shows that with the final few shots of the film of Odysseus and Penelope sailing west together, and then Telemachus becoming the new king. Odysseus is off to bury his fallen crew, and he's seeking closure to all of his grief in the unknown west. His final words include him expressing his hope for civilization to rise again, that dawn will return, and that humanity's mistakes will eventually fade as they will be forgotten. So the ending reminds us of Odysseus' violent past and the weight he continues to carry. Unlike the bleak ending quotes from Oppenheimer in that Nolan film, you can say that Odysseus' departure here has a small sense of hope. By removing himself from Ithaca, he gives his people the space to heal, and he attempts to heal himself. The director has taken the position that the people who messed up should move out the way and give the future generation a chance to make things right, and that is symbolized through both Odysseus leaving and Telemachus taking the throne. This has actually been a thematic concern for Nolan in a few movies now, especially if you look at the protagonists who fight to save the world in Tenet, or even Oppenheimer during the final hour of that film. Oppenheimer may feel more doomed in those events, as communicated by the very end of the film, but that doesn't stop him from fighting or campaigning throughout. The flip side to all of this with The Odyssey, though, is in the sense of doom that Odysseus expresses. In one of his last lines in the movie, Odysseus specifically says, "And dawn will break over the darkened world, and our mistakes will once again be forgotten." Notice the use of the phrase "once again," suggesting a repetition of mistakes and problems that humanity has caused. And not to mention that this story is almost 3,000 years old. So through Nolan's posterity trilogy of films like Tenet, Oppenheimer, and now The Odyssey, I think the director is communicating both a sense of hope for the future, but also a worry in that maybe we are doomed to repeat our failures. Of course, some of us, like myself, choose to be hopeful when we see the endings to these films, but the messages within them are still quite alarming. Moving on, the other big question that I think many people will have come the end of The Odyssey is the functioning of the gods, and specifically what we see with Zendaya's Athena. Throughout the film, we see Athena appear and disappear to Odysseus a couple of times on his actual journey, but then also on Calypso's island and towards the end of the film back in Ithaca. And during Odysseus' final speech, the film reveals to us that the face of Athena is Odysseus' projection. Her face becomes the face of a young woman he watched die during the sacking of Troy. Her image had followed him ever since, becoming a living reminder of all the horror that he helped unleash. Nolan uses this reveal to reframe the entire story, potentially suggesting that the gods might not have a say in what he's been through, and that his trauma might be the thing that has actually guided him. This version of The Odyssey becomes not only a tale of survival, but a portrait of a man who believes he helped break the world. His reluctance to return home comes from what he witnessed in Troy's fall, in the brutality of it, the innocent lives lost, and the knowledge that his own stratagem through the Trojan horse made that destruction possible. With war threatening to rise again, he feels responsible for whatever darkness might come next. So the first answer to the appearance of Athena is that, just like we see in the film, she is a projection of his guilt. But the other side to this is that if Athena and the gods are real, then Athena might just be appearing as that woman who lost her life at Troy. And the reason I'm addressing both sides of this is that I think the portrayal of the gods in The Odyssey is a big talking point throughout it. For instance, in using an example from Homer's poem, Calypso releases Odysseus from her island because of a sign from the gods that she should do so. Zeus orders her to do so, and this is because Athena begs Zeus to free Odysseus from Aegea. Zeus sends the messenger god Hermes to tell Calypso to let him go, and while Calypso is angry at that decision, she obeys that divine command. But in Nolan's film, if you listen closely during some of the Calypso scenes, she hears thunder. So the way the gods are presented are essentially an open-ended question in Nolan's film. They are addressed like Zeus with the thunder, Odysseus' projection of Athena as guilt, and then even the smaller details of the sea goddess Ino when Odysseus attempts to be allowed back home on his raft. So the question of whether they are real or not can be endlessly debated. I really like the way Nolan approached this element in his film because he could have just gone the conventional approach of having gods in the sky or over-the-top visualizations of them. But he decided to make it more open and meaningful to us in the real world today, and how specific signs that characters see through all the elements make us question their existence. And again, the portrayal of Athena and Odysseus' guilt at the end of this film is at the very heart of that question. Moving on from the talking points of the ending, some of the other big questions in this adaptation focus on both Zeus's law and the repeated mention of the Sea People. Starting with Zeus's law, we are introduced to this right at the very start of the film when Telemachus speaks with his mother Penelope. In Nolan's The Odyssey, the tagline "Defy the gods" and the emphasis on Zeus's law work together as a thematic tension. Essentially, Odysseus is a mortal who repeatedly challenges divine authority, yet the world he lives in is governed by a sacred moral code of hospitality, the rule that is known to be protected by Zeus himself. Nolan uses this clash to frame the story as a struggle between individual will and cosmic order. It's the golden rule of treating strangers as you would want to be treated. And in Homer's world, hospitality is survival. Travelers depend on the kindness of strangers, and violating this law is a serious moral failure. What's interesting is that this theme still resonates today because trust and kindness hold communities together. For example, in the story, Odysseus defies divine authority, especially with Poseidon later on, asserting a sense of human agency against cosmic punishment. Yet the world's moral order is divine, rooted in Zeus's law that humans must treat each other with dignity. So in that sense, like all of Nolan's protagonists, Odysseus is flawed, clever, and morally tested. He resists the gods' control, but must still navigate the ethical framework they created, or so they believe that the gods created. This idea is baked into the film as a central thematic of it, and Penelope tries to explain to Telemachus that the suitors completely destroy that principle. She says that the structure of their kingdom is nothing without respect for its meaning. And again, you see that concept challenged, followed, and discussed in different ways throughout the film. Regardless of the god's existence or not, or what people believe, I think Nolan actually takes a determined approach to it. This is exampled by the final act of the film when Odysseus tests the suitors to see if any of them show kindness, but none of them do. They haven't for years, and that only results in them being punished for it. Of course, Odysseus is guilty himself in many ways of abandoning that principle throughout his journey, but it's how he recognizes his failures and tries to learn and heal beyond getting his vengeance. And in my opinion, I think that's Christopher Nolan sending a message in that humans can and need to learn to treat each other with more dignity. When it comes to the repeated mention of the Sea People, we do hear about them throughout this adaptation, and it's known that the arrival of these people will apparently bring an end to the Bronze Age. For years, scholars have argued over whether the Odyssey might function as a kind of narrative cipher that is capable of revealing the identities of real historical tribes, or perhaps a single powerful confederation whose moments help trigger the Bronze Age collapse. We know that the Bronze Age civilizations of the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, and the Hittites did collapse, and that some of them did indeed mention the Sea People. The civilizations that followed can be seen as the barbarians who replaced them. So Nolan takes that long-running debate and threads it directly into the film's own meditation on opposing war, letting the question and its resolution echo through the story's deeper moral currents. It's a sharp piece of myth and historical speculation that is integrated into the film's thematic fabric. And the twist put on this idea is that, as we learn at the very end of the film, Odysseus believes that the destruction of the Bronze Age actually took place during that fateful night at Troy, and that they could actually be the Sea People. In his mind, he and his men could be the mentioned Sea People who were foretold to bring ruin to civilization because of that fateful night. Think of it in a similar way to Oppenheimer, when at the very end of that movie, J. Robert Oppenheimer says that he believes that they have already destroyed the world. Now, like a lot of things that I've already discussed, there is a chance that there are two sides to this question. As a counterbalance to Odysseus' feelings at the end, there are a few things that happen that could suggest that they aren't the rumoured people from the sea. After Troy, Odysseus and his crew land at one abandoned village, and shortly after that, they meet the Laestrygonian giants who destroyed 2 of their 3 ships. Within the year, the rest of the men in Odysseus' fleet perish. They didn't encounter enough communities to create the rumour of them being people from the sea. At the same time though, you could argue that the very event of Troy itself is the point of the Greeks being labelled that. That night itself brought about the end of a civilization. And I think this is exactly what Nolan is aiming to get at with the mention of the Sea People. I think Nolan is using them as a mirror held up to Odysseus, to Greece, and to the fragile idea of order itself. I think that the Sea People represent the world breaking down, and they are what Odysseus could become if he lost himself completely. They are the human cost of a world where kingdoms burn, gods are forgotten, and the old rules no longer hold. The Sea People have no homeland, no king, no law, and they are people without names. They are those of conflict, showing what happens to ordinary people when heroes chase glory. Nolan has always been obsessed with systems under strain, whether it be Gotham, the dream world, or even time itself. And in The Odyssey, I think the Sea People are the embodiment of a world where the old order has shattered. So Nolan uses them to underline that civilization is not guaranteed and that it must be protected, rebuilt, and sometimes reinvented. And that's also why the concept of Zeus's law and treating strangers as you would wish to be treated is so prominent in this film. The Sea People are the shadow of Odysseus' journey, and they are what happens when the world loses its stories, its laws, and its gods. So Nolan uses them to remind us that heroism is not just about slaying monsters, but about holding civilization together when everything else is falling apart. The Sea People are the warning, the mirror, and the future all at once. Now that I've covered some of the deeper questions in the Odyssey, it's time to answer some of the smaller plot-related and character questions. The first is the purpose of the Iliad elements in the film, and in particular, the inclusion of Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, and the sacrifice of Iphigenia. During a flashback scene between Odysseus and Penelope from when Telemachus was a boy, Odysseus tells her about his fear in refusing to follow Agamemnon into war. He's fearful that if he refuses, Agamemnon will take their son, just like the sacrifice of his own daughter, Iphigenia. In Homer's epic, before the Trojan War, the Greek fleet was stuck at Aulis because Artemis, angered by Agamemnon, sent winds that prevented sailing. The seer Calchas declared that only the sacrifice of Iphigenia, who is Agamemnon and Clytemnestra's daughter, would appease the goddess. Knowing Clytemnestra would never allow it, Agamemnon, with Odysseus and Menelaus, devised a deception. They summoned Iphigenia to Aulis under the false promise that she would marry Achilles. Odysseus was one who was sent to escort her and Clytemnestra, and in many versions of the story, he is a fully willing participant. The deception shatters Agamemnon's marriage, and Clytemnestra and her secret lover plot Agamemnon's death upon his return from Troy. And we do end up seeing these sequences briefly in the film. So essentially, Iphigenia's sacrifice becomes the dark prologue to the entire tragedy of the Atreid family and the core motive behind Clytemnestra's revenge. And it's this backstory which also echoes through the Odyssey's plot, as Agamemnon's doomed homecoming becomes a cautionary parallel to Odysseus' tense return to Penelope. It's framed as both a plot point in Odysseus fearing his own son Telemachus being taken if he refuses to follow Agamemnon, and then Agamemnon himself being a dark mirror to Odysseus. It's to show what Odysseus could become, what homecoming can look like when everything goes wrong, and then what the heroic age ultimately costs. Furthermore, the next question is another for those who do know the source material, and that is why Achilles was not featured in the Hades scene. In Homer's Odyssey, Achilles appears during Odysseus' descent into the underworld, and their exchange is one of the poem's most striking reversals of heroic values. Odysseus approaches Achilles expecting to find the great warrior proud of his eternal fame, but Achilles tells him that he would rather be a living servant than a dead hero. That moment is Homer's way of dismantling the heroic code from within, in that the greatest champion of the Trojan War admits that glory is meaningless in death. It's a scene that reframes the entire epic, showing that Odysseus' journey is not about reclaiming honour, but about reclaiming life, home, and identity. Nolan understood this moment, and his decision to remove Achilles from the underworld sequence in the film is a deliberate thematic choice that transforms the meaning of Odysseus' descent. In Nolan's The Odyssey, Achilles' absence becomes a powerful statement about the collapse of the heroic age. By omitting the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, Nolan is signalling that the values Achilles had embodied have no place in the world Odysseus is trying to return to. The underworld in the film is not a hall of heroes, but a graveyard of consequences, a place where Odysseus confronts the human cost of the war that he helped wage. Achilles reinforces the idea that the heroic code has died with him, and that Odysseus must abandon the old ideals if he hopes to survive the journey home. So instead of meeting Achilles, Odysseus encounters Agamemnon, whose story is far more relevant to the film's emotional architecture. Agamemnon embodies the dangers awaiting Odysseus at home, in a kingdom in disarray, a marriage poisoned by absence, and a household destroyed by betrayal. So Agamemnon keeps it grounded in the fragility of domestic life, the very thing Odysseus fears losing. You also may notice that in Nolan's film we also get Elliot Page's Sinon in the underworld, and Sinon is not in Homer's The Odyssey. He is a figure from Greek mythology who first appears in Book 2 of the Virgil Aeneid, an epic poem written by the Roman poet Virgil. And it's known that in that poem that Sinon is the Greek soldier who helps carry out Odysseus' Trojan horse plan. Nolan then uses Sinon in Hades to force Odysseus to confront the darker side of his identity. The Trojan horse is Odysseus's most famous act, but it's also the act that killed thousands, ended a civilization, and set the stage for the suffering that fills the rest of the film. Sinon is the human face of that act, in the one who delivered the lie, who persuaded the Trojans, and who made Odysseus's plan possible. So seeing Sinon in the underworld means Odysseus must face the human wreckage of his own cunning. Achilles would have told him that glory is meaningless, but Sinon silently shows him that glory is destructive. The final question that some who know Homer's Odyssey might have surrounds the use of the lotus flowers in the film and why Calypso held Odysseus for so long on her island. Odysseus was held on Calypso's island for 7 years after journeying back from the siege of Troy. He speaks with Athena in the very first of these scenes in the film, and we learn that she wants him to both remember his past and to leave. In Homer's epic, Odysseus is trapped on the island of Ægina and held captive by the nymph Calypso, who desires him as her immortal husband. While she offers him eternal youth and endless sensual pleasures, Odysseus spends his days weeping on the beach, longing to return to his wife Penelope and his home of Ithaca. In Nolan's movie though, we return to the island throughout the film and we learn that Calypso has been giving Odysseus the lotus flower, which is this adaptation's way of integrating the Lotus Eaters. In the poem, the Lotus Eaters are a mysterious tribe encountered by Odysseus's crew, and they live entirely on the honey-sweet fruit and flower of the lotus. This acts as an addictive narcotic that erases memory, ambition, and all the desire to return home. So Nolan's film has basically combined the Lotus Eaters and Calypso into this one segment throughout that we return to. Having lost his men and memories, Odysseus is kept captive under the guise of healing until a sort of rehab allows him to leave. Now, like I mentioned before, during some of the scenes with Calypso, you do notice that she hears thunder, and this is a neat reference to the very first book in Homer's epic poem. In book 1 of that story, Zeus agrees with Athena that it's time for Odysseus to leave Calypso and finally begin the last stretch of his journey. So this repeated use of thunder in the film is essentially a sort of reference to that decision being made. And again, you could frame it as Calypso hearing this thunder and seeing it as a sign to release him. But having now watched the movie a few times, I think it's now a bit clearer why she keeps him there and then why she does let him go. Nolan reframes Calypso as the personification of avoidance, the seductive urge to stay numb rather than confront pain. She keeps Odysseus there because she believes she is protecting him from the world that broke him. But the longer he stays, the more he deteriorates as his memories blur, his identity thins, and his purpose dissolves. Nolan shows Calypso watching this erosion with growing dread throughout the film, and then she also hears those signs of thunder. So she doesn't let him go because she stops loving him, she lets him go because she finally understands that keeping him there means erasing him. When we come back to Odysseus being on the island later on in the film, he stops taking the lotus flower, aided by Calypso herself, and then he regains his memories by remembering Penelope with the Athena pin that she gave him. But that was my video discussing some of the questions that arose from Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. I'm sure there will be many other things that pop up on rewatch and other examples which you guys may have picked out, so don't forget to let me know down below in the comments section. Also, if there is anything else that you can add to the topics I've already raised in this video, then let me know, as it will be interesting to dissect the finer details as time passes. For much more videos and breakdowns, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.